An egotistical freelance musician, a conservative press secretary, and a gleaming grand piano. What started as a smug attempt to ridicule turned into a moment that silenced the crowd and cracked a carefully constructed ego. It all began inside the lavish lobby of the Willard Intercontinental Hotel in Washington, D.C. The space buzzed with light chatter and political banter, guests sipping champagne beneath glittering chandeliers. Karoline Leavitt, just 27 and the youngest White House press secretary in U.S. history, moved through the room with polite composure. To most, she was the iron voice of the Trump camp, sharp, steady, and fiercely composed. But hidden beneath that polished exterior was a piece of her past few had ever seen. Then, without warning, the doors flung open. In strolled Ethan Caldwell, celebrated pianist, darling of progressive circles, and a man who wore his arrogance like a tailored suit. The sound of laughter dimmed as heads turned. Without so much as a nod to anyone, he headed directly toward the piano in the corner. Fixing his eyes on Karoline, he smirked. "Well," he called out, his voice slicing through the chatter. "Can the press secretary play, or does she just hit keys for Trump?" A few liberal reporters chuckled loudly. Phones went up, fingers hovered, recording began. The setup was perfect, a viral moment in the making. Karoline felt every gaze land on her. Her hands tightened at her sides. Ethan cocked his head mockingly. "Come on," he teased. "Let's see some actual skill, if there's any under that press pass." The energy in the room shifted. What had started as background noise now had the tension of a courtroom. The piano was no longer just decor. It was a stage, a test, a trap. Ethan Caldwell stood casually by the grand piano, fingers resting lightly on the lid, eyes locked on Karoline like a predator circling its prey. Laughter still lingered in the air, mingling with the clink of glassware and hushed conversations. He didn't rush. He knew how to drag out a moment, turning silence into his spotlight. To him, this wasn't just a jab. This was a takedown, a public unmasking of a conservative icon, with all eyes watching. "Don't be shy, Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice like silk, hiding a blade. "You're quick with reporters. Surely you've got something more than podium talk." He tapped out a few notes on the piano, the disjointed tones echoing through the lobby like a challenge. Or is that all just noise too? Karoline remained still, feet planted, heart pounding. The chandeliers above lit her black dress like armor, but inside she felt exposed. Around her, liberal journalists stared with amused expectation. Some conservatives watched in wary silence. She'd handled ambush interviews, harsh press briefings, but this wasn't that. This felt deeper, more personal. Ethan stepped away from the piano, arms outstretched like he was on Broadway. "Picture this," he said, raising his voice. "The Trump press secretary sits down and plays. What'll it be? A New Hampshire lullaby or a good old key-mashing session?" Laughter erupted, sharper now. A voice from the crowd shouted, "Play us something, Karoline," as if this were some Roman arena. Heat rose in her face. She was no stranger to pressure. She'd defended divisive policies on national television, but this moment was foreign. Ethan wasn't attacking her job. He was prying at something buried long ago. She inhaled deeply, and something stirred within. A memory. A younger version of herself, sitting at a church piano in small-town New Hampshire. Worn keys, old hymnals, borrowed books, hours spent alone with the music, back before she was told to be practical. Politics had been the path. Music? That was left behind. Now Ethan was dragging it back out, for mockery. Karoline glanced toward her team. One aide, Mark, subtly shook his head, whispering, "Don't. It's a setup. If you mess up, the media will destroy you." He was right. One missed note, one awkward moment, and tomorrow's headlines would be merciless. But if she walked away, Ethan would win. He'd label her a coward, and the narrative would write itself. Ethan watched her pause, and his grin stretched wider. With a flourish, he sat back down and teased the opening notes of Moonlight Sonata, then stopped abruptly. "That's music," he smirked. "Not political circus tricks. But hey, I get it. You've got speeches to rehearse." A few people clapped. Karoline's throat went dry. She looked down at her hands, once fluent in scales and harmony, now used to microphones and memos. Trump's voice echoed in her mind. "Never show weakness, Karoline. Hit back. Always hit back." She'd lived by that rule, through firestorms at the podium. This was no different. Ethan leaned in again, voice lowered, just enough to seem intimate, but still loud enough to be heard. "I play for justice causes, the kind your boss mocks. I doubt you even understand what real art is." Then, with a smirk, he gestured to the piano like it was a sword in the ground. "Prove me wrong, if you can." The air was heavy now. Cameras raised higher. The murmurs swelled. Mark whispered again, "Walk away. Don't give him this." But Ethan's smug expression, so certain she'd fold, lit a fuse inside her. Karoline exhaled slowly, eyes on Ethan. "Fine," she said, voice low but firm, slicing clean through the noise. "Watch closely." Karoline Leavitt stood motionless, her stare fixed on Ethan Caldwell. "Watch closely," she had said, and now those words hovered in the air like a dare. The room hushed. Whispers rippled across tables draped in silk, under chandeliers that suddenly felt too bright. Ethan raised an eyebrow, but his smirk had lost its bite. A flicker of uncertainty crept across his face. Maybe, just maybe, he'd underestimated her. "Well then," Ethan said, forcing casualness into his voice. Patting the piano lid like a host presenting a stage. "Can't wait to hear this. Don't disappoint us, Madame Spokesperson of the Keys." Liberal journalists chuckled again, but not as boldly. The tone had shifted. People were watching, now not just for mockery, but for possibility. Karoline took a step. The click of her heels on the polished floor echoed louder than it should have. Every eye followed. Inside, her pulse was thundering. This wasn't a White House press briefing, where she could slice with sound bites and policy lines. Here she was stripped bare, no script, no shield. Mark caught her eye again, nearly pleading, "Don't do this." He wasn't wrong. One mistake and it would be replayed endlessly. But she wasn't thinking about the media anymore. She was thinking about what Ethan had said. "You don't know what real art is." It wasn't just a jab. It was a shot at her soul. Did he think she was a hollow shell in heels? A political automaton? Her fists clenched, nails biting skin. No, she wasn't walking away. She remembered another moment, years back. A confrontation with a liberal reporter while working for Elise Stefanik. He had tried to corner her with accusations. She hadn't flinched. Afterward, Trump had placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've got guts, Karoline. Never let them drag you down." So why was this any different? Only one reason. Fear. Not of Ethan, but of the piano. How long had it been? Her hands hadn't touched keys in years. They typed statements now, gripped microphones, held coffee on 3 hours of sleep. What if she sat down and blanked? What if her fingers froze? She imagined fumbling a chord, Ethan's laughter cutting through the room, conservative donors recoiling, the headlines writing themselves. "You looking for the exit already?" Ethan teased. Breaking into her spiral, he stepped in closer, mock concern painted across his face. "It's fine. Not everyone's brave enough for the stage." Maybe stick to those scripted speeches. He turned away, smug and sure it was over, but glanced back, eyes gleaming, waiting to see her retreat. That was it, the last straw. A fire ignited in Karoline's chest. It wasn't fear anymore. It was fury. Fury at being boxed in, underestimated, mocked. Again. "I don't need a second invitation," she said, voice calm but commanding. Gasps fluttered through the room. She moved toward the piano. Every step was heavy, deliberate. Her heart hammered in her ribs like a drum line. Mark stared, stunned. Ethan spun to face her, eyebrows raised in disbelief. "Wait, are you serious?" he asked, but now his voice carried something it hadn't before. Doubt. Karoline didn't answer. She sat down slowly, adjusting the bench. Her hands hovered over the keys. Polished, cold, unfamiliar, but somehow welcoming. She closed her eyes, took a breath. The noise around her faded, replaced by a memory. Afternoons in that New Hampshire church, playing for no one but herself. She let her fingers settle. And then she began. The opening notes of Rhapsody in Blue spilled softly into the air, tentative at first, like a whisper asking permission to be heard. Karoline's fingers danced cautiously at first, tracing the melody, like rediscovering an old language. The sounds were soft, uncertain, but clear. The kind of quiet that demands attention. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Hadn't expected her to actually start. Still smirking, he leaned toward a nearby reporter and whispered something dismissive. But even he couldn't hide the shift in the room. Karoline leaned into the keys. Her right hand began gliding through delicate phrases, her left grounding the rhythm. Each chord struck with growing confidence, no longer hesitant, but sure. The music began to swell. Phones, once raised to mock, now recorded in awe. Guests who had chuckled before now leaned forward in silence. Even those skeptical of her politics couldn't deny what was unfolding. Halfway through the piece, Karoline wasn't just playing. She was remembering. Her body moved with the rhythm like it always had, like it never stopped. A moment from her past flashed in her mind. A rainy night in New Hampshire, 15 years old, practicing at home. Her mother, exhausted from work, had sat nearby and listened. "You've got something special," she'd said softly. "Don't let anyone take it from you." Karoline had let it go. For the role, for the image, for the armor she fought politics required. But now, that strength was flowing back through her fingertips. Rhapsody in Blue roared to its climax. Her hands moved with precision and passion, no longer shaking, no longer unsure. The music was fierce and full, rising like a wave over the crowd. This wasn't the poised press secretary behind a podium. This was the girl who used to disappear into melodies when the world got too loud. She wasn't performing. She was remembering who she was. Ethan stood frozen, arms still crossed, but now rigid. His smug posture had melted into something more uncertain. His eyes fixed on the woman at the piano, no longer a target, but a force. He didn't speak, he didn't smirk, he watched. And the room changed. A conservative congressman stood mid-piece and began clapping, unable to hold it in. A few others followed. The applause rippled like a rising tide. Karoline didn't notice. She struck the final notes with power and grace. The last chord echoed through the chandeliered lobby before fading to silence. She sat there a moment longer, breathing hard, hands resting on the keys. Then, silence. And suddenly, an explosion of applause. Thunderous, full-bodied, Not polite clapping, not partisan, genuine. Some reporters clapped too, reluctantly at first, but then with real respect. Her aide Mark stood still, mouth open, stunned into a mix of pride and disbelief. "Karoline, that was incredible," someone shouted. She finally looked up. Faces that once smirked were now stunned. Some confused, some smiling, but all of them watching her differently. And Ethan? He was still standing in place, hands in his pockets, trying to hold composure. But his lips pressed together, and his eyes, they betrayed something else. He'd come to embarrass her, but now he was the one silenced. He clapped, slowly, almost performatively. "Not bad," he said, loud enough for her to hear. But the arrogance was gone. Karoline stood, the chair sliding back. Her legs were unsteady, but her back straight. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. The music had already spoken. Applause still thundered across the Willard Intercontinental lobby as Karoline Leavitt stepped away from the piano, steadier now than when she had approached. The final echoes of Rhapsody in Blue lingered in the air like a held breath. She didn't glance at Ethan. She didn't have to. The crowd's reaction said everything. Ethan remained a few feet from the piano, hands still jammed in his pockets. But the confident stance was gone. The smirk that had once disarmed now looked more like a shield, one that had cracked. He clapped again, awkwardly, trying to regain footing. "Not bad," he repeated, slightly louder, as if forcing the words might reclaim control. But no one cared. Karoline turned to the crowd. Applause had settled into waves, mixed with shouts and cheers. "That's our Karoline!" someone shouted. A politician, possibly a senator, fist raised in triumph. Mark appeared at her side, tapping her shoulder. "You scared the hell out of me," he muttered, eyes wide, then broke into a grin. But damn, that was something else. Not everyone clapped. In a far corner, a group of liberal journalists huddled, murmuring. One woman with short, bright red hair whispered to her colleague, "She's way better than I thought." The words sounded more like a confession than praise. "But it doesn't change her politics," another replied, frowning. "Maybe not, but it changed something." A few guests came up to Karoline, shaking her hand, smiling warmly. "I had no idea you played like that," said an older woman, probably a donor. "You made us proud." Karoline offered a small smile, not out of arrogance, but quiet relief. Her heart was still beating fast, adrenaline still rising and falling like a wave. But she had it under control now. Then she looked for Ethan. He had drifted away from the piano, now standing near a small group, his people. One young man clapped him on the shoulder, trying to offer cover. "She really got you, man," a woman in a green dress said under her breath. "Didn't see that coming." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He took a drink someone handed him and stared around the room, searching for a comeback that wouldn't come. The moment wasn't his anymore. Across the room, an older man, maybe a centrist journalist, approached Karoline with a small mic. "Miss Leavitt," he said earnestly, "where'd you learn to play like that?" "That was incredible." Karoline's answer was simple. "A long time ago," she said, "but I never forgot." Meanwhile, the outside world had already caught fire. Phones buzzed nonstop. Clips from the performance spread like sparks on dry grass. On X, Trump supporters celebrated. "Our press secretary just destroyed the left with talent," a conservative influencer posted. Karoline Leavitt MAGA's secret weapon. Hashtag surged. Hashtag Karoline plays. Hashtag MAGA music. Hashtag talent over trash. Even some neutral voices joined in. Not a Trump fan, but I've got to admit, she's got serious skill. Ethan glanced toward the door, his jaw tight. He could feel it, the narrative slipping away. "They're overhyping it," he muttered to his group. "It's just one song." But his voice lacked conviction. The young guy beside him smirked. "No, man, you miscalculated. She didn't just play. She owned the room." Karoline didn't react. She gave Ethan one final glance. Not mocking, just steady. There was no need for words. She had already said what she needed to say, without ever opening her mouth. Ethan tried to hold her gaze, and failed. He turned away, walking toward the drink table, as if escaping the weight of what had just happened. The energy in the Willard Intercontinental slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Clinking glasses, muted conversation, ambient music. But the air still pulsed with the aftershock of Karoline's performance. She stood near the center of it all, surrounded now not by skepticism, but admiration. Supporters approached, handshakes and compliments flowing freely. "You showed him what real class looks like," said an older man, clapping her on the back. "That liberal thought he could embarrass you," a woman added. "You gave us something to be proud of tonight." Karoline nodded politely, offering brief thanks, but her eyes quietly scanned the room. Ethan Caldwell was gone, vanished from his earlier corner, likely slipping out to avoid more attention, or the lack of it. Out on social media, the buzz only grew louder. Conservative accounts were on fire. Posts from Trump loyalists painted her not just as a capable spokesperson, but a symbol of cultural strength. She doesn't just defend policy, she performs. This is why we win: grace, grit, and skill. Even neutral users began chiming in. "I'm not a fan of her politics, but she crushed that performance. Respect." Not everyone praised her. One liberal reporter wrote, "Being able to play piano doesn't fix Trump's policies. Don't be fooled by the show." But the criticism couldn't dull the moment. Karoline quietly slipped away from the crowd, finding a quiet corner near a large window. Outside, Washington's streets buzzed with light. She took a breath. Slow, grounding. She had done it. Not just faced Ethan, but faced herself. Faced the buried part of her she'd been told to leave behind. She pulled out her phone and texted her husband. "Guess what I just did?" She smiled, imagining his reaction. Nicholas Rio, always her biggest supporter, even 32 years her senior. Back at their modest apartment, he was probably already watching the clips. Later that evening, she returned home. Their baby son was asleep in the crib beside Nicholas. "I saw it," he said, pulling her into a hug. "You've gone viral." Karoline laughed, sitting beside their old piano, the one she barely touched anymore. Nicholas gave her a look. "Play it again," he said, "just for me." She hesitated, then placed her hands on the keys. She played a soft, stripped-down version of Rhapsody in Blue. Not for a crowd, not to prove anything, just music, for them. When she finished, Nicholas asked, "How do you feel?" Karoline paused, looking out the window into the quiet night. "Like I just remembered who I am." She had once believed music was a weakness, something too soft for the harsh world of politics. But tonight, she'd learned the opposite. It wasn't her liability, it was her edge. She had faced a challenge not with talking points or party lines, but with the truth of who she was, and she'd won. Tomorrow she would return to the podium. Same job, same battles, but not the same Karoline. Now she carried a reminder that strength doesn't always come from volume or titles or even applause. Sometimes it comes from the courage to play.